The moment she set foot on our porch, something felt off, not just unusually wrong in a way that made me think we were about to get pulled into something much bigger than a fake HOA inspection. My wife stood firm while I recorded from the screen door, my pulse racing, because everything about this woman's tone screamed authority, but none of it added up. When someone waves around paperwork that looks official but can't answer basic questions, you know trouble's coming. I've never felt so cornered in my own home. Tell me honestly, would you have handled it differently? Even now, I'm unsure if we made the right move. Never in a million years did I imagine the woman pounding on our door about a so-called lake inspection would turn out to have a federal warrant. Saturday morning was perfect lake weather, but the way this stranger moved across our porch made the air heavy. Her steps were too practiced, too deliberate, as if she'd rehearsed this entire performance before showing up. I was in the kitchen making coffee when voices outside grew louder, and something in their tone made me freeze. It carried that raw edge of desperation you feel in your gut before your mind catches up. Rachel was on the porch, locked in a standoff with Diane Mercer, our 45-year-old HOA president. Both of them looked like they were bracing for a battle. Diane waved a stack of papers like they were weapons, but the way she clutched them too tightly made me think she was afraid they'd expose her if anyone looked too closely. "You're not coming inside this cabin," Rachel said, her voice sharp and steady, the kind of firmness you'd use on a pushy salesman who refuses to take no for an answer. From behind the screen door, I whispered my doubts, but Rachel didn't waver. She didn't even glance back for reassurance. She just folded her arms and stared Diane down with the calm certainty of someone who knows the rules are on her side. Even from where I stood, I could see that the documents Diane carried were printed on ordinary office paper, full of spelling errors. She called them emergency cabin inspection forms for lake safety violations, but the whole act felt staged. My skin crawled watching her. Rachel had spent 3 years working as a county property paperwork inspector before we moved here, so she knew exactly what authentic documents should look like. The paper, the stamps, the seals. When Rachel told Diane she had no legal authority, I saw panic flicker across Diane's face for just a moment before she plastered her aggressive expression back on. Our cabin had been standing on this lake for 15 years before we even bought it built properly, with every required permit. Yet Diane pointed at everything like she was conducting some high-stakes survey that would determine our future. She claimed we were violating community safety standards, even going so far as to call our fully legal dock a looming environmental disaster. Rachel calmly reminded her that our deed clearly showed ownership of the entire lakefront, predating the HOA itself. That's when Diane's hands began to tremble. She shifted her weight nervously, like she was trying to hide something far bigger than her phony inspection. Then she crossed the line. Without warning, Diane tried to shove past Rachel to peer into our cabin as if she had the legal right to barge in without permission or a warrant. Rachel blocked her completely, small but immovable, standing in the doorway like a bouncer refusing entry to someone without proper ID. That's when I finally stepped outside, still recording, and told Diane firmly to leave immediately. But things were unraveling far too quickly for what should have been nothing more than a petty host squabble. What struck me hardest was how irrational she became when Rachel produced our actual deed stamped, sealed, and verified by the county. Instead of backing off, Diane doubled down, shouting that our deed was fake and insisting our cabin was unsafe. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was clutching obviously forged papers in her shaking hands while dismissing our legitimate deed as fraudulent. Finally, Diane stormed off toward her car, muttering about safety violations and community rules, clutching her fake documents like they were holy scripture. Rachel and I just stood there, stunned, trying to process what had happened. "She's unhinged," Rachel said flatly, shaking her head. And she was right. Diane wasn't just stubborn, she was dangerous. Watching her car disappear, I felt it deep in my gut. This wasn't the end. Not even close. Something darker was driving her actions, and it was only a matter of time before she came back. Sure enough, by Monday, Diane had escalated. She plastered our front door with bright orange unsafe structure notices, taped across the entire surface like we were a condemned building. They were clearly homemade, but convincing enough to make neighbors stop and stare. Rachel tore them down immediately, But the damage was already done. People began stopping to snap pictures and whisper questions, and suddenly it felt less like a neighborhood disagreement and more like a coordinated attack. The whole stunt seemed designed to humiliate USA, painting a picture that our home was some kind of dangerous hazard. The community app lit up with Diane's posts, each one more dramatic than the last. She accused us of endangering families with illegal cabin modifications and shared photo after photo of our dock, insisting it was a disaster waiting to happen. The posts poured in constantly, several every hour, written in alarmist language to stir up panic. I couldn't believe anyone would go this far over a bogus inspection claim, yet there it was for the entire neighborhood to see. The comments turned into a battlefield, neighbors taking sides based only on Diane's word. I sat scrolling through the thread with a pit in my stomach, watching our reputation unravel over lies and forged papers. That afternoon, the situation got even stranger. Diane marched back onto our property with a measuring tape and clipboard, moving around like she was conducting some kind of official survey. She measured distances from our cabin to the shoreline, snapping photos and jotting notes as if she were a government inspector. When I confronted her again about trespassing, she lifted her clipboard like it was a badge of authority and claimed she was documenting violations for the county. The arrogance was staggering. I stayed calm, recorded everything, and ordered her to leave. She just smirked and kept working as though I was the intruder. Rachel immediately called the actual county office. The clerk on the other end sounded baffled and confirmed what we already suspected: there were no pending inspections, no requests, and certainly no record of anyone named Diane Mercer having authorization. "Ma'am, if someone is pretending to represent the county, they're lying," the clerk said, even asking if we wanted to file an impersonation complaint. That sealed it. Diane wasn't confused either. She was running an elaborate scam, but convincing the rest of the community would be the real challenge, because people tend to latch on to the first story they hear. I decided to push back through the same app she was using. I posted a blurred photo of our deed, details hidden for privacy but enough to prove long-standing ownership of both the lakefront and the cabin. I wrote that our family had held legal rights for decades, with all documentation properly filed. Within an hour, my post was reported several times and buried at the bottom of the feed. Meanwhile, Diane's dramatic violation warnings stayed pinned at the top, gathering comments and shares like wildfire. It felt rigged, as if she had helped manipulating the online discussion. The neighborhood split just as I expected. Half blindly accepted Diane's alarmist claims, trusting her official act without asking for proof. The other half started raising questions. Why was the HOA president suddenly fixated on our cabin when other properties had similar docks and structures? A few even asked her directly to provide credentials. That's when Diane's tone shifted. Her posts grew angrier, more defensive, like she was losing control of her narrative. Our once quiet lakeside community was turning into a war zone. And then something happened that made me realize Diane's campaign might go far beyond lies and fake documents, as she might actually be threatening people. One of our neighbors, Owen Parker, had been on our side at first. He openly questioned Diane's authority, even calling her behavior harassment. But after a private conversation with her, his comments flipped overnight. Suddenly, he was parroting her line, "Cabin safety is everyone's responsibility." The shift was so abrupt it felt unnatural, like someone had gotten to him. What could Diane have said to change his stance so completely? Looking back, I think she may have been threatening people, hinting at liability, fines, or worse. At the time, I had no evidence, and Owen wouldn't tell me a word. All I knew was that someone who'd seemed reasonable the day before had turned hostile. Then came the note. Wednesday evening, we found a piece of paper wedged in our cabin door frame. It looked like something out of a thriller movie, a blurry photocopy with only 3 words visible: failure to appear. It chilled me. Someone in this community clearly knew more about Diane than we did, something serious enough to send a cryptic warning. But they weren't brave enough to reveal themselves. The handwriting was deliberately disguised, and the paper felt like it came off a cheap home printer. Was it a warning meant to protect USA or a setup for something worse? The timing was suspicious, arriving just as Diane's harassment campaign was hitting its peak. Rachel found it first, holding it carefully like it might explode in her hands. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice tight with worry, What if she's planning something bigger than fake inspections? And I could see the fear settling into her eyes. After days of Diane's relentless harassment, that blurry photocopy still haunted me. Failure to appear. I sat staring at it, turning the phrase over and over in my mind. Was it some kind of legal notice? A missed court date? A warrant she'd ignored? Whoever slipped it to us clearly wanted us to know Diane had skeletons in her closet, serious legal troubles that might explain her desperation to assert fake authority over our cabin. But they weren't brave enough to come forward outright. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay awake replaying the note, Owen's sudden flip, and Diane's bizarre obsession with our property. My thoughts circled endlessly around the same question. Was the anonymous messenger trying to protect USA or set us up? Either way, I had a sinking feeling we were about to uncover exactly what Diane Mercer was hiding, and I wasn't sure either of us was ready for it. Thursday proved me right. What came next made everything up to that point look like child's play. Around noon, Diane showed up again, this time with reinforcements. Two HOA board members I barely recognized trailed behind her, along with Owen Parker, walking as if he were now part of her official entourage. They came carrying a ladder, tools, and what looked like professional inspection equipment. For a brief moment, my stomach dropped. What if we had been wrong? What if there really was some regulation we'd missed? Owen nodded along as Diane declared they were conducting an emergency compliance inspection under HOA emergency powers. It sounded intimidating, and I hated to admit it, but for a second, it made me doubt Rachel's certainty. One of the board members, an older man in his 60s, kept glancing nervously around like he wasn't convinced he should even be there. The other, a woman close to Diane's age, seemed more confident but checked her phone constantly as if she were following some kind of procedural checklist. I remembered hearing from a neighbor that another cabin had been fined recently for unauthorized repairs, and the thought crept in, was this part of some legitimate safety crackdown we'd missed? But then Diane crossed a line that erased any doubts. Without permission, she marched right up onto our deck, poking at the siding and prying at boards, loudly declaring she was inspecting for structural hazards. When Rachel stepped outside and saw Diane trying to peer through our windows, the fury on her face said everything. This wasn't an inspection, it was trespassing, plain and simple. The two board members shifted uncomfortably as Diane carried on, their unease growing by the minute. The nervous man finally spoke, asking who exactly had authorized this inspection. Diane waved him off with vague talk about emergency community safety protocols. When he pressed her for actual paperwork, her polished mask cracked for the briefest second. She recovered quickly by lashing out, ranting that questioning her was endangering the community. The act was falling apart, and yet, somehow, people had still followed her here. Even Owen. That's when Rachel and I had our first real clash about how to handle this madness. I'm not proud of it. I was still half convinced we could be wrong. I suggested letting them finish their so-called inspection just to make it stop, thinking that maybe once Diane got what she wanted, she'd finally leave. Rachel looked at me like I'd lost my mind. If we give in now, she said, she'll never stop. And she was right, though I couldn't see it then. We ended up arguing right there in front of the neighbors. It was humiliating, but it also made me realize something. Rachel's instincts were sharper than mine in this situation. While Rachel and I argued, I noticed Owen pacing like a caged animal. He kept checking his watch, looking restless, like he either had somewhere else to be or was starting to regret siding with Diane. When one of the board members finally asked him point-blank why he thought this inspection was necessary, his answer was weak at best. He mumbled about community safety and responsibility, but the words rang hollow. Then something happened that gave me the first real crack in the fight. The Section 8. I told the group that we'd already confirmed with the county no inspection had been requested. No authorization existed. The moment those words left my mouth, Owen's face drained of color. He backed away slowly, edging toward his car like he just realized he was in over his head. That evening, I decided it was time to dig deeper into Diane Mercer's past. Nothing about her behavior matched the role of someone genuinely working for the community. A quick search of her name pulled up a trail of old photos from another Tona, but in those, she wasn't going by Mercer at all. She was listed as Diane Mills. The photos showed her in familiar poses, standing at community events, presiding over home meetings, always clutching papers that looked official. Papers that now, I suspected, were just as fake as the ones she'd been waving in our faces. What stopped me cold was an old newspaper article. It mentioned a Diane Mills who left town abruptly after a financial scandal involving homeowner assessments. Suddenly, her behavior here made perfect sense. That mysterious photocopied note, the one shoved into our door frame earlier in the week, started clicking into place. Blurry words, failure to appear. Someone out there knew exactly what Diane was running from, and they wanted us to know too. They weren't brave enough to reveal themselves, but their warning felt urgent. The handwriting was deliberately disguised, the paper cheap and smudged, but the message was chillingly clear. Diane wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president on a mission. She was hiding from something bigger, and we were about to get dragged into it. About 20 minutes later, Officer Martinez rolled down our street, his patrol car creeping slowly like he was sizing up the scene before stepping out. From my window, I watched him pause behind the wheel, probably reviewing dispatch notes about the dangerous property dispute. When he finally got out, he carried himself like a man used to handling neighborhood squabbles, calm, steady, not expecting much. Diane wasted no time. She rushed at him, talking fast, waving her stack of forged inspection papers like they were gospel. She pointed wildly at our dock, our cabin, anywhere she could make look suspicious, throwing around phrases like illegal modifications and community endangerment. From my vantage point, I could see her laying it on thick, handing him her fake papers with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed this routine dozens of times. Officer Martinez listened patiently, nodding here and there, jotting a few notes, but the way he shifted his weight told me he wasn't entirely convinced. And that's when I knew it was my turn. Instead of standing back recording like I had for days, I stepped out with Rachel at my side. We carried our deed and the photos I'd taken of Diane trespassing on our deck. Taking a deep breath, I introduced myself with as much composure as I could muster. "Officer, my name is Daniel Carter. This woman has been harassing us for days with forged documents, claiming she has authority to inspect our cabin." I handed him the deed, then pointed out the glaring spelling mistakes on Diane's so-called inspection forms. Rachel backed me up, calmly explaining her background as a former county property paperwork checker. She described exactly how authentic documents should look, what stamps, seals, and formatting they required, and then highlighted every flaw in Diane's counterfeits. "These aren't county issued," Rachel told him firmly, holding up the crooked stamp on cheap paper. "We even called the county yesterday, and they confirmed she's not authorized to represent them in any way." The county had already confirmed me that no inspection request existed for our property, and no one by the name of Diane Mercer was authorized to represent them. That was when Officer Martinez's expression began to shift. As he compared our official records with Diane's sloppy forgeries, the confidence she'd been carrying all week started to unravel. He held up her fake documents, his tone sharp but controlled. "Ma'am, these don't match the county's format," he said plainly. "And according to the official records, Mr. and Mrs. Carter legally own this lake and cabin. That means you've been trespassing every time you've stepped onto their property." Diane tried to cut in, throwing out more excuses about community safety, but the officer raised his hand to silence her. He kept studying the evidence we'd given him, his expression hardening with each detail that didn't add up. Then came the moment everything changed. At the instant her carefully constructed scam began collapsing in real time. His voice grew heavier. "These aren't just unofficial papers, they're forged county documents, which is a criminal offense." Diane went pale as he spelled it out. This wasn't just harassment anymore. What she had been doing could land her in serious legal trouble, including multiple felony charges. But Martinez wasn't done. He asked for her driver's license, his tone polite but edged with the suspicion of someone who knew he was dealing with far more than a neighborhood spat. Diane's panic deepened. She hesitated, muttered something about misunderstandings, and kept glancing toward her car like she was weighing whether to make a run for it. Rachel and I stood quietly as the officer walked back to his patrol car to run her information. My wife whispered, disbelief in her voice, "I can't believe she thought she could get away with forged county documents." But I was starting to see it differently. Diane's reaction wasn't just fear of being caught and Aaliyah her pacing, her obsessive phone checks, The way she kept glancing at the road, it all suggested she was terrified of something bigger than fake paperwork. Martinez sat in his car for what felt like forever, typing, checking his radio, scanning whatever came back on his screen. Diane grew more frantic by the minute, begging him to come back, insisting this was all just a miscommunication, but he barely acknowledged her, holding up his hand from behind the window to signal he needed more time. And in that moment, it hit me, the anonymous note shoved into our cabin door hadn't been about a controlling neighbor. It had been a warning that Diane was hiding from something far worse. When Officer Martinez finally stepped out of his car, the look on his face was nothing like when he'd first arrived. Gone was the casual patience of a cop handling a neighbor complaint. Instead, he looked sharp, focused, like a man who'd just uncovered something much bigger than he expected. "Miss Mercer," he said firmly, his voice heavy with authority, "I need you to step over here." Diane instinctively backed away, but there was nowhere left for her to run. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that her past had finally caught up with her. Standing there, watching the officer approach, I knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. Martinez's expression told me the entire situation had changed in just those few minutes he'd spent running her background. What began as a petty harassment complaint had just exploded into something far more serious. The irony wasn't lost on me. Diane had called the police on us, expecting her fake authority to scare us into submission. Instead, she was about to learn the hard truth: real authority doesn't bend to theatrics. "Miss Mercer," Martinez repeated, his voice sharp and commanding, "step over here, now." Her eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape she no longer had. Diane's eyes darted back and forth between the officer and her car, like she was weighing whether she could bolt. Then Officer Martinez's next words landed like a thunderclap, sending a jolt of satisfaction through me stronger than winning the lottery. "You currently have an active warrant for fraud charges out of your previous state," he announced. I watched Diane's face collapse as her worst nightmare unfolded right there in our driveway, the very place she'd been trying to intimidate us for days. The warrant had been issued a year and a half ago for defrauding homeowners through phony HOA fees. Since then, she had been living as a fugitive. "Miss Mills," Martinez continued steadily, "you're under arrest for failure to appear on felony fraud charges. And given what you've been doing here, forgery and impersonation will be added as well." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing. The truth about Diane Mills, now hiding under the name Mercer, spilled out like something straight from a crime documentary. Every detail only validated the fight Rachel and I had put up against her. She had once run an elaborate scam in another community, conning homeowners with fake HOA assessments and bogus emergency repairs. When residents started questioning her and demanding proof, she had skipped tone of vanishing before charges could stick. And now, she'd simply picked a new target: our expensive lakefront cabin. Her obsession with paperwork, inspections, and control suddenly made perfect sense. This revelation happened right as a monthly community board meeting was underway at the center just yards from our cabin. Curious neighbors began drifting outside, drawn by the chatter on the police radio. For one brief moment, as Officer Martinez explained the charges, Diane's mask slipped. The hardened manipulator disappeared, replaced by someone fragile and broken. She created real tears this time, murmuring that she only wanted to belong and never meant for things to spiral so far. For about 5 seconds, I almost pitied her, but then, just as quickly, her bitterness snapped back. She erupted, shouting that we had set her up, that it was all some conspiracy to destroy her. The swing from sorrow to rage happened so fast it left me dizzy. Word of her arrest raced through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Half the community had seen her in handcuffs, and by the time my phone started buzzing with texts, everyone knew. Neighbors who had defended Diane's so-called safety campaign were suddenly silent, embarrassed that they had backed a fugitive. Owen Parker showed up within half an hour, pale and shaken. "She told me you were planning to sue the HOA," he confessed, running his hands through his hair. "She said I could be held personally liable if something happened at your dock." From the gathering crowd, someone shouted, "That's the woman who fined me for my paint color last month." Instantly, neighbors began remembering the suspicious citations, threats, and demands she'd been throwing around since arriving. Rachel, never missing her moment, delivered the perfect line as Diane was cuffed and guided toward the patrol car. With a dry smile she said, "Well, I guess the inspection is complete now and we found exactly what needed finding." I burst into laughter despite the chaos. She had summed up our nightmare in one perfect sentence, right as our tormentor was hauled away for multiple felonies. Before driving off, Officer Martinez searched Diane's vehicle. What he uncovered sent a chill through everyone. Inside was a notebook, a page after page of neighbors' names with dollar amounts scribbled beside them. She had mapped out a plan to target every high-value property in the community, tailoring fake violations and fees to what she thought each family could afford without putting up a fight. There were also sheets of official county letterhead she'd been using to forge documents, and contact lists of other neighborhoods she'd scouted in case she had to relocate again. And then the most disturbing find, a detailed timeline for her scam. Our cabin was listed as Phase 1A test run, with step-by-step notes on how she intended to launch a fraudulent maintenance fee scheme. Watching the patrol car disappear down the street, Diane trapped in the back seat, I thought to myself, she built a web of lies to trap USA and got caught in it herself. Diane's plans didn't stop at our cabin. In her notebook, she had outlined Phase 2, a full-scale rollout of her scam across the entire community within 60 days. That realization hit me hard. Our refusal to cooperate had unknowingly protected every family in the neighborhood. She hadn't just been testing USA, she had been experimenting, refining her arguments to see which tactics would sway different types of property owners. But instead of sharpening her con, she ended up exposing herself to the entire community. If we had given in to her staged inspections, she would have escalated to demanding thousands in fake repair fees and safety upgrades, eventually draining the savings of nearly every homeowner along the lake. Rachel and I spent the rest of that afternoon giving Officer Martinez a full account of Diane's behavior, from her first bogus inspection attempt, to her trespassing, to the constant harassment that had consumed our lives for days. Retelling it all felt surreal. What had once seemed confusing and menacing now fit perfectly into a calculated scheme that had collapsed the moment she chose the wrong people to mess with. "You two handled this exactly right," Officer Martinez told us when he wrapped up our statements. "If you hadn't resisted and kept records, she could have fleeced half this community before anyone realized what was happening." Even with Diane in custody, Rachel's hand clutched mine tightly as she stared across the water. "Something tells me this isn't over," she murmured, and I knew exactly what she meant. A community doesn't bounce back overnight after learning it harbored a fugitive. Who else knew about Diane's past, and what would they do now that the truth had surfaced? The next evening, an emergency meeting was held at the community center. I had never seen it so packed. Neighbors filled every seat, tension buzzing in the air as embarrassed, unsettled faces turned toward the board. The surviving board members looked shaken, clearly rattled after spending the day consulting attorneys about their potential liability for having supported Diane's antics. This was no longer ordinary HOA business. When the floor opened for comments, Owen Parker rose first. His voice trembled as he read from a prepared note. "I owe Daniel and Rachel Carter a formal apology," he announced to the crowded room. "I was misled about the inspections authority, and in supporting it, I unintentionally contributed to the harassment of innocent homeowners who were actually protecting us all from systematic fraud." The board members who had accompanied Diane during her sham inspection sat rigidly, their faces pale. They stumbled through public apologies of their own, admitting their role in what was now undeniably criminal harassment. An older gentleman explained how Diane had pressured them, warning of liability issues and insurance risks if inspections weren't carried out. A female board member admitted she had doubts from the beginning, but Diane's forceful manner and the official-looking paperwork had intimidated her into silence. Both announced their resignations on the spot, acknowledging they had forfeited the community's trust and that new leadership was necessary to establish proper safeguards for future decisions. Then came the twist no one expected. A federal agent, Johnson, entered the room, instantly raising the stakes. What many thought was just a neighborhood dispute had now become a federal case. Because Miss Mill's scheme crossed state lines, this falls under federal jurisdiction. Agent Johnson explained. "We'll be conducting a thorough investigation into her activities and into whether she had accomplices here or elsewhere. Whole communities across multiple states may have been targeted." Her words made several people shift uneasily in their seats, as though they suddenly realized they might not be as far removed from the scandal as they'd hoped. The possibility that others in our own neighborhood could have knowingly helped Diane was a bombshell. Owen spoke again, this time sharing details that shocked everyone. He revealed how Diane had cornered him privately, brandishing legal-looking documents that threatened personal liability for board members. "She told me if someone got hurt at Daniel and Rachel's dock, I could be sued directly," Owen confessed, his voice shaky. "She singled me out, used fear and intimidation, and I believed her." Owen's confession hit the room hard. He admitted that Diane had shown him what looked like official legal documents, warning that if anyone got hurt at the Carter's dock, board members who questioned safety compliance could be held personally and financially responsible. The papers seemed legitimate at the time and terrified him into believing that siding with her was the only way to protect his family from financial ruin. Now, he realized, they were likely forged just like everything else she used to push her scheme. But not everyone in the community was ready to move forward. Some neighbors seemed more offended by the humiliation of being tricked than by the crimes committed against innocent families. Two households even demanded that Rachel and I prove ownership of our property in front of Evernia, insisting we show deeds and permits to validate our cabin. "Just because she was a fraud doesn't mean there aren't real safety issues," one argued, still clinging to the belief that their suspicion had merit despite having supported harassment orchestrated by a criminal. This denial fractured the room further. Some neighbors rallied around us, acknowledging that we had protected everyone from systematic fraud. Others, embarrassed by their gullibility, wanted the whole ordeal buried quietly without ever confronting their mistakes. A few even grumbled that we should have just allowed Diane's inspection to avoid all the drama, failing to grasp that compliance would have opened the door to widespread financial exploitation. Agent Johnson soon quieted the murmurs with a shocking update. Federal investigators had already uncovered evidence of Diane's scheme stretching far beyond our neighborhood. She had successfully collected fraudulent maintenance fees from 3 families by convincing them to pay in advance, promising lower costs later once her fabricated community-wide safety program was rolled out. Prosecutors would now pursue restitution, compensation, and damages for harassment and defamation. This announcement created mixed emotions. Families who had been duped felt embarrassed, while others were frustrated that compensation would take time as the federal investigation continued. Still, it was a relief to know that justice and repayment was on the horizon. The meeting closed with decisive action. By unanimous vote, the community adopted strict verification procedures for all future HOA business requiring multiple signatures, public documentation, and independent oversight before any fees could be assessed. Owen volunteered to serve as treasurer, pledging transparent, audited accounts. Several other neighbors stepped forward, determined to rebuild trust through open leadership. "We are rescinding every citation Diane ever issued," the interim board president declared. "Any fees she collected will be refunded immediately, pending the federal investigation." As people filed out of the center, I sensed the heavy mix of relief, shame, and lingering unease. Healing would take time, but at least the truth was out. The next morning, Rachel mailed Diane's own inspection notice back to her jail cell along with a photocopy of our property deed and a simple note, "Inspection complete. Violations found." It felt like the perfect closing statement to our ordeal. Looking back at the packed room where neighbors had turned against one another over a fraudster's lies, I realized something vital. Justice is always worth pursuing, even if it temporarily divides a community. Protecting against real criminals mattered more than preserving false harmony. As Rachel and I returned to our cabin, watching the lake ripple in the late light, we knew we had made the right decision even at the cost of a few friendships. Diane was the only one who truly needed inspection, and together, we had delivered the most thorough background check this community had ever seen. But the story wasn't finished. Months later, Rachel and I sat inside a federal courthouse, watching as Diane Mills was brought before the judge. Just the beginning of a larger reckoning. Diane entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, looking nothing like the domineering HOA president who once terrorized our neighborhood. Months behind bars had worn her down. Her face was pale, her frame thinner, but what struck me most was the expression of defeat etched into her features, far deeper than just physical decline. Her public defender, a weary-looking woman in her 50s, flipped through paperwork and whispered to her client in hushed tones. I braced for what I thought would be a simple proceeding. Agent Johnson had told us to expect a straightforward plea deal. Diane would admit guilt to fraud, forgery, and impersonation charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of roughly 18 to 24 months in federal prison, along with full restitution for every victim. Rachel and I had been relieved by that prospect. We just wanted closure, justice served, and our lives back. But when the judge called the case and Diane's lawyer began outlining the plea agreement, the script suddenly flipped. Diane interrupted her attorney mid-sentence, her voice faint but unshakably firm. Your Honor, a broken bar. I need to tell them about the others. A ripple of shock passed through the courtroom. Her lawyer froze. Agent Johnson sat up sharply, and every eye turned toward her. Diane pressed on, ignoring the frantic look from her defender. I wasn't working alone, she said. People in the community knew exactly what I was doing and helped me plan it. The silence was so heavy it felt like the air had been drained from the room. Johnson quickly requested a recess, but the judge allowed Diane to continue. 2 current HOA board members, she revealed, had known about her prior fraud charges and actively assisted her. They fed her information about property values, insurance policies, and which families were most vulnerable, those likely to pay bogus assessments without question. As she spoke, her voice gained strength. The judge looked just as stunned as the rest of us, but he let her keep going. What she described was no accident, it was organized, deliberate, and disturbingly local. The 2 board members who had accompanied her to our so-called cabin inspection weren't Macron v. Dupez. They had researched our finances and insurance, helping Diane calculate exactly how much money they could try to extort. Our plan was to declare the dock an environmental hazard, Diane explained coldly, and demand $50,000 from every lakefront owner for remediation. The scale of her scheme was staggering. Our cabin wasn't the prize, it was the test. If Rachel and I had caved, Diane and her partners would have rolled out Phase 2, extracting massive remediation fees from every family on the lake. Few homeowners could have disproven environmental hazard claims, and most would have paid up rather than risk losing their insurance. At Johnson's signal, federal officers entered the courtroom. Within moments, the 2 board members Diane had exposed were brought in and placed under arrest. Seeing neighbors we recognized from countless community meetings in handcuffs was surreal. For months, they had portrayed themselves as duped by Diane's manipulation, when in truth, they had been co-conspirators. The older man who had stood with her at our cabin looked shaken to his core, trembling as officers cuffed him. The woman who had conveniently resigned after Diane's arrest carried herself with the same cold confidence she had worn during her false apologies. Then Diane unraveled completely. Realizing her confession had doomed not just herself but her accomplices, she broke down, screaming across the courtroom at us. I just wanted what you had, she cried, her mask cracking for good. You with your cabins and perfect lake lives, why should you have it all while others are barely surviving? Why shouldn't I take some of it? Why should you own an entire lake when people are struggling to pay their bills? Her rant spiraled into a bitter tirade about inequality and resentment until the judge was forced to call for order. Diane's meltdown had exposed the ugly truth. Her crimes had been fueled by jealousy and a deep sense of entitlement. Once she admitted to the conspiracy, the legal stakes shifted dramatically. Instead of the lighter sentence she might have received for individual fraud, prosecutors now pursued far harsher penalties for masterminding a multi-state criminal operation with multiple co-conspirators. The judge postponed sentencing for at least 6 months, giving investigators time to unravel the full extent of the scheme and identify additional victims and accomplices. This case has clearly grown beyond simple fraud, the judge declared. Leaving the courthouse that day, I felt a strange mix of vindication and disbelief. Rachel squeezed my hand as we crossed the parking lot, both of us knowing our quiet lakeside community would never feel the same again. I still can't believe we were living next to people plotting to steal from us all that time, Rachel said, her voice heavy with amazement. As we drove home, it struck me that our ordeal wasn't just a personal victory. If it had happened here, how many other neighborhoods across the country were facing the same kind of organized deception? And could we somehow help protect them from the fraud we had stumbled into and exposed? 2 years later, those questions still lingered in my mind, but so did hope. Our very first Honest Lake Day proved how far we had come as a community. 40 neighbors gathered on the beach, kids laughing and splashing in the water, while adults shared barbecue and stories without the shadow of suspicion that once hung over every interaction. The phony inspection notices were gone for good, replaced with a simple wooden sign reading "Welcome to Carter Lake," a reminder of our rightful ownership, but also an invitation for everyone to enjoy the water responsibly. Rachel and I decided to open the lake to the community every summer, turning a place once used as a weapon of intimidation into a symbol of unity and healing. Justice finally came, and in ways that exceeded even our hopes. 18 months after Diane's confession, the court handed down sentences: 4 years in federal prison for Diane Mills, along with restitution for every family she had targeted. That restitution covered not only the stolen money but also damages for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. Her 2 board member accomplices each received 2-year prison terms for conspiracy, plus heavy fines. All 3 defendants were ordered to contribute to a community fund, which was soon used to buy new playground equipment and fund neighborhood improvements. Diane's house was seized and sold to help cover restitution. A young family moved in, filling the home with laughter instead of schemes, replacing years of criminal plotting with the sound of children playing in the yard. The transformation that followed was remarkable. With the conspirators gone, the neighborhood quickly rebuilt trust. Owen Parker was elected the new HOA president on a platform of total transparency. Any expense over $100 now required 3 signatures and was publicly posted. The community app was upgraded with strict verification rules for official announcements, and every monthly meeting included a fully documented financial report open to anyone who wanted to review it. New homeowners were given a welcome packet explaining the fraud conspiracy and the safeguards put in place to prevent history from repeating itself. Rachel and I came out of the ordeal stronger too. The stress had tested our marriage, but it had also taught us to communicate more openly and trust each other's instincts. Looking back, I realized that even our disagreements had pushed us toward better teamwork. At our second annual Lake Day celebration, I turned to Rachel and said, "I'm glad you stood firm when I was ready to just give in. You saved our home. You saved our community from systematic fraud by refusing to back down, even when it would have been easier to just let her fake inspection slide," I told Rachel. The financial resolution went far beyond anything we had expected. The court awarded damages and restitution to every single family affected by Diane's scheme. Not only were they reimbursed for money she had taken, but they also received compensation for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. Our own settlement was enough to fund upgrades that transformed the neighborhood: brand new playground equipment, a renovated community center, and professional landscaping for the shared spaces that had been neglected while criminals were siphoning away HOA funds. In a strange twist, the court had forced the very people who tried to break us to pay for the improvements that made our neighborhood stronger than ever. Before long, the media picked up the story. A local news station ran a feature on the HOA fraud ring that had targeted lakefront homeowners, interviewing Rachel and me about how we stood up to organized harassment. From there, the story spread, appearing in HOA newsletters and community management websites across the region as a cautionary tale. This case shows just how important it is to verify authority and demand proper documentation, the news anchor concluded. Sometimes, asking a few simple questions is all it takes to expose criminal fraud. The ripple effect went further than anyone expected. Federal investigators uncovered similar HOA scams in 6 other states, leading to arrests and the recovery of hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars. Our case became a training model for both federal agents and local police, teaching them how criminals infiltrate HOA boards to commit systematic fraud. Now, law enforcement agencies regularly warn homeowners: never accept authority at face value, always demand paperwork, and never allow entry to your property without verified proof of legitimacy. Months later, As the sun setting streaks of gold across the lake during another community gathering, Rachel lifted her beer and grinned. To cabin inspections that actually find what needs to be found, she toasted. I clinked my bottle against hers and added, and to communities that protect each other from real criminals instead of attacking innocent neighbors. The cheer and applause that followed felt like the final closing of a painful chapter. Children played freely, their parents relaxed and laughing, and for the first time in years, our community felt whole again. Looking back, I realized the real lesson wasn't just about catching scammers or even helping to take down a fugitive. The heart of it was this: even a divided, damaged community can come back stronger when people choose honesty over convenience. We didn't just remove fraud, we rebuilt something better. So, if someone ever bangs on your door claiming to be an inspector, don't be afraid to ask for proof. Call the real office. Trust your gut, because the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one speaking the truth. If you've stuck with me this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Would you have done the same? Hit that like button if this story resonated, and subscribe if you want more real-life chaos breakdowns. You can even tap the thanks button if you'd like to support the channel. Stay sharp, neighbors. Not every knock at the door is just a knock. Thanks for watching Drama Nest. More wild stories are on the way.